Welcome to episode 272 of FBI Retired Case File Review with Jerry Williams. I'm a retired agent on a mission to show you who the FBI is and what the FBI does through my books, my blog, and my podcast case reviews with former colleagues. Today, we get to speak to, once again, retired agent Mark Safarik, who served in the FBI for 23 years, 12 of those as a senior member of the FBI's Elite Behavioral Analysis Unit, BAU, where he established himself as an internationally recognized expert in the analysis and interpretation of violent criminal behavior. In this episode, Mark reviews a fascinating family annihilation mass murder case that he analyzed during the investigation and also provided expert testimony during the subsequent trial. It is a unique case because it features behavioral attributes, staging, depersonalization, undoing, and proprietary behavior that are often seen individually, but very rarely in combination. The subject, Vincent Brothers, murdered his wife, their 3 young children, and his mother-in-law. Mark has appeared on Dateline, Court TV, Forensic Files, New Detectives, A&E, Oxygen, Discovery ID, and many news networks to discuss his cases. His television series, Killer Instinct, premiered in 2011. He was a longtime consultant for the popular television shows CSI Las Vegas, Bones, and The Blacklist. And he has 2 seasons of cold case homicide TV shows in both Sweden and Denmark. Now, during the interview, Mark and I also talked about how FBI profilers are portrayed in crime fiction. You'll be able to listen to our review during the interview of Taking Lives, a serial killer thriller starring Angela Jolie as an FBI profiler. But I also wrote up a blog post review of the movie that you can read on my website. Mark also sent me a list of the TV shows and movies he gives a thumbs up to for their believable portrayal of FBI profiler characters. I've included Mark's list in the show notes. In your podcast app's description of this episode, there's a link to the show notes, as well as where you can buy me a coffee, join my reader team, and check out my crime fiction and nonfiction books. During the last episode, I asked you to continue to spread the word about FBI Retired Case File Review, and I can see that you did just that. The show continues to grow and reach more people. Thank you for your support. Now here's the show. I want to welcome my guest back again, Mark Safarik. Hey, Mark, how are you?
Hey, Jerry. Great. Thank you for having me back. I sure enjoyed the first time that we had an opportunity to speak.
Yeah, that was episode 204. We talked for more than 2 hours. I think I edited it down to like an hour and 50 minutes, but we covered so much during that episode.
I know time flies when you're talking about things that you really are interested in and that are enjoyable and interesting.
Yeah. I was absolutely fascinated. I kept asking you questions and questions and questions, not just about spree killing, which is what the episode was about, but also about how you got into the unit, which I know is a typical question that you get, but I wanted to make sure that I shared that with my listeners. We just talked about true crime and the work that you're doing in television. We went on and on and on. It's fascinating. And listening to it a second time, since it's been over 2 years since that episode aired in June of 2020, I was enthralled once again. So what are we going to talk about today? There's so much that you could share with us about the work that you are doing and have done in behavioral analysis.
What I wanted to share today was a fascinating case that I worked on. I was contacted in this mass murder case that happened in Bakersfield, California in 2003. And what I really like about cases like this is where I come into the case and there's no suspect at the time. And then I go to the scene, I look at everything, I talk to the investigators, I review all the case material, and then I write an assessment. And then eventually in that case, I ended up testifying as an expert witness at the trial. To go through all of the aspects of the case is really interesting. And this is an unusual case in the sense that most of the time in the complex homicide cases that I work, whether they're a multicide case, like a double, triple, or quadruple murder, or whether they're serial murders, mass murders, or spree murders, you typically have an offender's MO or modus operandi, and sometimes you have their ritualized or need-driven behavior. On occasion, you can have staging behavior by offenders, or you can have depersonalization or undoing or proprietary interest. And in some cases, you'll only have one of those aspects. But this case, I think, is really interesting because you have all of them, all of these behavioral dynamics within a single case. When you look at all of the dynamics, that behavior points you in a particular direction that I think was very useful in this investigation.
You've got me interested. So where do you want to start?
I do present this case, and usually I present it in a really detailed slide presentation. So I'm going to have to try to explain to your listeners like how rooms are set up so they can visualize what I'm talking about. So I will try to focus on that. Where I want to start the case is essentially how law enforcement became aware of it. On July 8th of 2003, a good friend of Joni Harper's had been trying to reach her. This was a Tuesday. She'd been trying to reach her on Monday and was unable to, which she found to be odd because she could usually get a hold of Joni. So on the 8th, Tuesday morning, she went over to Joni's house, which was located on the corner across from a high school, which also becomes an interesting dynamic. So she went over to the house. She knew that the house was going to be pretty secure because it was owned by Joni's mother, Ernestine. But she went over, she tried to get into the front door, was unable to, tried the side back door, was unable to. So went around into the backyard to a sliding glass door. Typically, this door would be locked, but it was unlocked. So she opened the sliding glass door, went inside, and that area was essentially like the family room area. And as you walked into this area, to the left would have been the kitchen and another small room that led to a hallway. And then down that hallway would have been Ernestine's room. So she had her room in the far end of the house next to the formal living room. And then if you turn to the right, there's a hallway that goes down to Joni's room. And so she was calling out for Joni and the kids because the kids should have been there as well. No answer. She goes to the right down to Joni's room. And as she enters the room, she sees Joni laying on the bed with her feet off the edge of the bed, but sort of canted in maybe like a 45-degree angle with her head towards the headboard. And Joni's covered in a sheet. There's blood on the sheet, and Joni's obviously not moving. And at the foot of the bed, facing the headboard, lies the 2-year-old, and she is also deceased. So this is a big problem. This freaks out her really close friend, and she runs out of the house and calls the police. When the police get there, the house is completely secure. All of the doors are secure, except for this sliding glass door. And the sliding glass door also has burglar bars on it. When you look at the layout of where this house is located, it's located on a corner lot right across from a high school. It's difficult to determine exactly when they were killed, but what the friend recounts to law enforcement is that on July 6th, which was Sunday, she was with the Harpers, Joni and Ernestine, and the kids, the 4-year-old Marcus, the 2-year-old Lindsay, and her 6-week-old infant Marshall. And they had all gone to church, which was typical for Sunday. So they had a routine. They'd gone to church at 9 o'clock in the morning. They're usually at church for about 3 hours. And then they typically all go to lunch. About noontime, they went to lunch at the Black Angus restaurant. And they were there till about 1:40 in the afternoon. And then they split apart and Joni drove back to her house, which was about a 15-minute drive. So that typically should have put her at her house around 2 p.m. They had a very regular routine. Joni and the kids would take a nap in Joni's room. So all three kids would be in Joni's room and Ernestine would be in her room. Then they were supposed to return to church around 6 p.m., but they never arrived back at church. So this friend of Joni's, Kelsey, called Joni around 8 p.m., but did not receive an answer. And then she called on Monday and didn't get an answer and then became worried. And that's why she went over fairly early on Tuesday morning. One thing that helped us was that during the first church service, the 9 to 12 church service, there was a video being taken of the people at church. And in this video, Joni and the kids are seen. So we know what they were wearing at the time. And those clothes were laid out in the bedroom where Joni was. Joni was just in her bra and underwear. And the kids were, Marcus was out of his Sunday best, and Kelsey still had her dress on. It became clear that they were killed sometime between probably 2 p.m. and 6 p.m. because they had not returned to church and the kids were still in their Sunday clothes and the Sunday clothes were laid out. So that really helped law enforcement focus when this crime occurred. And of course, their state of decomposition was consistent with having been dead for about 2 days. So whenever you have a family, especially in a family annihilation like this, where all members of the family are killed, you're always looking first to who could do this. And typically, the first suspects are always the husband or the wife or the boyfriend or the girlfriend, the person who's closest to them. Bakersfield police were immediately wondering, where is the husband, Vincent Brothers? Well, it turns out that Vincent Brothers was not in California. Vincent Brothers was in Ohio visiting his brother. So, of course, you have to rule the spouse in or out in cases like this. But another aspect that complicated the investigation and forced the police into these parallel investigations is that Ernestine Harper was an activist. She was a civil rights activist, but she was also an activist against gangs in Bakersfield because Bakersfield has a large gang population. She was very outspoken about gang problems and very vocal and was well known in the Bakersfield community for being an activist. So one of the concerns was this killing some sort of initiation rite for gang members to silence someone who was creating a lot of problems for them? That was a concern. They're looking at, is this gang problem? Who would do this? Because initially when they looked for Vincent, of course, Vincent is not in town. So, of course, they're trying to confirm when did he leave town? And it turns out that they discovered that Vincent had flown to Ohio on July 2nd. So now we have the murders on July 6th, but he left for Ohio on the 2nd. They confirmed that his vehicle was located at the airport bus in Bakersfield. Surveillance tapes there revealed that he bought a ticket and he boarded the bus to Los Angeles International Airport at 6 a.m. He boarded a United flight 106 to Chicago and then changed to a flight to Columbus, Ohio, where he arrived on July 2nd. They're like, okay, that's problematic for us because he would be the first person we should be looking at, but clearly he's out of state and actually he's quite a ways away.
He has a really, really good alibi.
Yeah, so he's got a very tight alibi, right? And so that's really good that the law enforcement can pin down this date, because then if you develop suspects, you want to be able to rule them out or in by alibis. So it turns out that his credit card was used on July 6th at a couple locations, a restaurant and a Walmart, really putting him there on the day of the murders. And, of course, Ohio to Bakersfield is several thousand miles. So it was very problematic for them. When you start looking at the location, is this a robbery that went bad? Is this a gang killing initiation? What do we really have going on here? If you look at where they live, this is a Sunday and they live on a corner lot across from a high school. So there's a lot of people walking around. There's activities going on at the track across the way. So you have a lot of potential witnesses. When you look at breaking into a home, when I went there, I started looking at the neighborhood and I took photographs of lots of the houses in the neighborhood around them. And none of the houses had a fence around the property. None of the houses had burglar bars on the windows. They all had a lot of foliage and fences. In other words, there were a lot of places for potential offenders to hide, to get to a house, break through a window, or access a back door without having a fence to go through or over. But Ernestine's house was completely different. She had a fence that went around the entire property at the sidewalk level. It wasn't a high fence, but it was about 3 feet tall, but still a fence. She had very little foliage around the house, so no place to really hide. And every single window and door on the property had burglar bars on it, which was interesting because none of the other houses in the neighborhood had burglar bars. Ernestine was so security conscious that when you went into the house, and almost nobody ever does this, you have burglar bars. You can't get through any of the windows or doors. But nevertheless, Ernestine had put a chair. You see it in the movies where somebody forces a chair under a door handle to keep somebody from opening the door. And that's exactly the way Ernestine had her front door. There was actually a chair propped up under the door handle. And on the back door, there was a metal bar that went to the floor that also kept you from opening the door. This house was incredibly secure. There literally was no way to get into this house. So that's a question I had. Like, how did the offender get in? Because there's no forced entry. They have to have a way to get in. What you see is that it does have a garage door, and it has an automatic garage door opener. What the police found was that the door from the garage to the laundry room was unlocked, which was unusual considering the security level of Ernestine. It's apparent that the offender came through the garage, through the laundry room, and then the laundry room connects to the hallway. And if you go down the hallway like 10 or 15 feet, you come to the entrance to Joni's room. And if you continue on, you come into the family room. And then if you go to the right, you go into the kitchen. And if you go straight, you go up into another small room that connects to the hallway that goes down to Ernestine's room.
You've mentioned the possibility of the husband did it, which is one of the first people that you look at. But you also mentioned gang activity. You haven't mentioned just somebody off the street coming into the house and killing the family.
Right.
Why is that?
Good investigators will have parallel investigations. You don't get tunnel vision focused on one particular person. Here we have detectives investigating the husband. We have other detectives contacting confidential informants who are gang members to find out, is this potentially gang related? And you have other detectives looking at, like, are there sex offenders in the area? Are there guys who have been arrested for felony burglary? So we've got parallel tracks of investigation trying to figure out, like, who would kill this whole family? So the initial investigation on Vincent, the husband, he's got this pretty rock solid alibi, and we have credit card purchases on the day of the murder. This is why the other aspects of the investigation, registered sex offenders, other felons that live in the area, gang members, all these different aspects, like who's doing this?
The usual suspects.
Well, yeah, usual suspects. And of course, mass murders of families are rare. Who really does that? And then you have to look at the victims here in this case. You've got a civil rights activist who's also extremely active and vocal against gang activity in Bakersfield, which is very high. And you have young children. I mean, you have a 4-year-old, a 2-year-old, and a 6-week-old. So who's killing children, right? That's a question. And we don't see it very often. So the police, Bakersfield has a number of homicides yearly, and the detectives are very good investigators. But you get faced with cases like this. Oftentimes you're going, what's going on here? Who is doing something like this? So when I got there, and I look at this whole thing, I'm like, if you're the burglar and you're going to break into this house, this is like the last house you would select. It's on a corner, so it's highly visible on two sides. Plus, it's got all of this security dynamics related to it. Not only did she have the doors barred, but she had dowels in all of her sliding glass doors. And I know a lot of your listeners probably do this in some of their windows and sliding glass doors, keeps the door from being opened. One interesting aspect was that the police noticed on the sliding glass door that Kelsey had originally come in, and the way that the police actually accessed the crime scene, she had a dowel in that window. And the dowel was actually out and was lying on the carpet, but at an angle. So it appeared that somebody had moved the dowel out of the track just enough that when you open the door, it wouldn't block the window from opening, but then would push the dowel out onto the edge of the carpeting. And you couldn't see that the dowel had been moved because they had a pretty significant drape that covered the sliding glass door. So you're starting to think, okay, well, how did that happen? How did the dowel get moved such that when the door was opened, it didn't actually block the window? So it looks like perhaps somebody set this up ahead of time. So now things are starting to come together a little bit. Let me set the scene for you. As the police walk into the garage through this open garage door, in the laundry room, Joni normally kept her purse on an ironing board, which she always had set up in the room. This was for convenience, so she could just grab her purse and head out to the car. But the purse wasn't on the ironing board anymore. The purse was on the floor, and all of the contents of the purse had been dumped and then gone through. Not like you're searching for cash, but in a way that was atypical of burglary. What I typically say is if you're going to steal something like the purse, then just steal the purse. But if you don't want to take the whole purse, then reach in and take the wallet, because that's where your cash would be. But instead, the offender, instead of dumping the purse out on the ironing board, they dumped it out onto the floor, which means they had to now get down on the floor. And then they started taking everything out of the wallet: the driver's license, credit cards, checkbook, papers, pictures, change. I mean, all of this stuff, this takes a lot of time. All of this stuff is laying on the floor. It's all spread out, but nothing appears to actually be missing. It's like you want somebody to think that you're searching for cash or you're searching for valuables, but in effect, nothing is actually removed. So that was interesting. It's almost like you're saying, hey, cops, this murder happened because I was searching for valuables here and I went through the purse and didn't find anything. And it's laid right out on the floor. I mean, you can't miss it when you walk in. You have to essentially step over it. So I thought that was
it's almost like a neon sign pointing, this is a burglary. This is a
exactly.
burglary.
That's what you're essentially looking at here, is somebody saying, hey, I don't want you to miss this, cops, because I'm going to make you step over it on the floor. So then the police went in and they went into Joni's room. So here's what they find in Joni's room. Joni's on the bed, as I mentioned. Her legs are off the bed. She's wearing bra and panties, but she's completely covered with a sheet. So the sheet goes almost up to her neck. She's been shot 4 times. She's been shot twice in the head, and she's been shot once in one of her arms and another in another arm. One travels through her arm and exits at her wrist. The other round travels through her arm, actually exits the arm, enters her mouth, and then ends up going down her trachea into her stomach. So interesting path travel for the bullet. Both of those wounds were really injurious, but not fatal. It was the 2 headshots that were fatal. And then, of course, visible is Lindsay, who's the 2-year-old, and she's lying on the bed in parallel to the width of the bed. And she has a single gunshot wound to her back. And it's clearly a near contact wound. There's stippling, which is unburned gunpowder on her little dress. Hidden from view is Marcus. Marcus is the 4-year-old son. The investigators don't initially see Marcus because he's covered with a couple of large pillows, but not pillows from the bed. The pillows actually came out of the family room adjacent to this room, which is an interesting dynamic. Marcus has a single gunshot wound to sort of the right forehead temple area with a lot of stippling, which means that the gun was held fairly close to his head. Not contact, but maybe a couple of inches away. The scene was being searched for hours, actually, before they actually discovered Marshall. The 6-week-old infant is actually laying between Marcus and Joni, and Marshall is covered with a blanket, a sheet, and pillows. So the cops weren't taking the scene apart yet for a couple of hours, and then they started to take the pillows off, taking photographs, and they discovered Marshall in the center of the bed, didn't even know he was there. Marshall had sustained a single gunshot wound to the back. He was lying on his stomach. The bullet traveled through him. As you can imagine, the 6-week-old infant's very small, traveled through him and ended up in the bedding beneath him. It appeared that the shot was straight up and down or perpendicular to him. It's as if the offender reached over the bed, because this is a king-size bed, reached over the bed and basically held the gun out over Marshall's back and then shot him. So the kids all sustain a single gunshot wound, and Joni sustains 4 gunshot wounds, but that's not all she sustained. Joni also has 8 stab wounds, several in her head. Most of them are in her mid to lower back. And these stab wounds were all post-mortem. So Joni had been shot and she was already dead. But the offender then used a knife to stab her repeatedly. What's interesting about this dynamic is that the stab wounds had been covered by the sheet. After she'd been shot, the offender retrieved a knife, and that knife was not located at the scene. And that knife came from a Cutco butcher block in the kitchen, because there's only one knife missing from that Cutco block. And that knife that's missing also had the dimensions of the stab wound. So it's pretty consistent that that's where the knife came from. But after she's stabbed, the offender then takes a sheet and covers her up. So all of the stab wounds are covered up, which is an interesting dynamic that we call undoing behavior.
Talk a little bit more about undoing behavior. I don't know if I've heard that term before.
Sure. Let me just go through the scene and then I'll talk about these different dynamics, because it really helps to understand them in sort of the sequence of how things occurred. So as the police went through the house, at the very other end of the house, they discover Ernestine. And Ernestine is lying in the hallway about a foot outside of the door to her bedroom. And she has been shot twice in the face. And she is lying on the floor. There's quite a bit of interesting blood spatter that is both on the walls and then on the carpeting behind her going into her bedroom. She had this really old revolver, an Ivers Johnson revolver that she had secured and was heading down towards Joni's room when she was shot. The gun had really, really old ammunition. I don't know if it would even have fired, but she had armed herself as she exited her bedroom. Somebody got to her very quickly, had maneuvered through the whole house very quickly to get to her, because she'd only exited the room. She was just outside her bedroom door. Here you have 5 victims in this house, all shot with a .22 caliber pistol, and Joni sustaining the majority of the injuries. Typically, we would expect that the adults in a homicide scene would sustain the most injuries because adults would be the biggest threat to the offender. So typically, when you have, say, a husband and wife both killed, the husband will be killed first because he presents the biggest physical threat to the offender. In this case, Joni is with the children. She presents the biggest physical threat. So she is shot first and killed in bed while she's sleeping. It's clear that she never knew that the offender was there. The question is, like, how did this crime happen, right? How did they not hear somebody coming into the house? And that's one of the jobs that I have to do when I do this kind of an analysis, is like, put this together. Essentially tell the story of this crime in a way that it makes sense, both in chronology of the events and in time, the temporal component, the time aspects of these events, in a way that it makes sense. Because I had to do this for the trial. I had to explain to the jury my interpretation of these dynamics. And how does all of this occur? How do you get into this locked environment, this extremely secure environment? How do you get in? Here's how I figured out what happened. To get into the house, somebody had to know the schedule of Joni and the kids and Ernestine on Sunday, and they had a very regular schedule. They had to come to the house while Joni and the rest of them were at church in the morning. They used a garage door opener to open the garage. Once they were in the garage, they had a key then to open the door into the laundry room, which remained unlocked. Then, of course, everybody's asleep. They've brought the gun with them because the gun is not recovered. So they bring the gun and they take the gun. Now, the laundry room is connected to that hallway, which leads right to Joni's room. Here's what I said happened. So the offender now walks down the hallway, comes into Joni's room, and everybody's asleep. The offender first shoots Joni in the head twice. And upon doing this, this wakes Marcus up. So the 4-year-old wakes up and he sits up. And then the offender walks around to the front of the bed and he shoots Lindsay in the back. Now, Marcus is awake and he's sitting up, and I'll explain how I know this. Marcus is awake and he's sitting up and he's looking at the offender. But then the offender hears Ernestine. Ernestine is screaming. She heard the gunshots. She's up and moving. She's retrieving the gun and she's screaming for Joni. She's a rather big woman, and so she had pulled her pantyhose down around her waist to make her sleep more comfortably, but she's still dressed. So she gets up, she's trying to get oriented so that she can move down the hallway. But the offender hears this, and so the offender leaves Marcus sitting up in the bed and runs out of the room down the hallway. When you look at the layout of the house, the most logical way to get to Ernestine's room, the shortest way, is to go straight up this little few set of stairs into this nondescript kind of room next to the kitchen, which was full of all kinds of boxes and a couch, and then into the hallway, which had a lot of boxes and things in it, and then to Ernestine's room. That's the shortest way, but it's not the most logical way. If you didn't know this house, the way you would go is to run through the family room, into the kitchen, through the kitchen, into the formal dining room, and then turn to your left and go through the formal living room to the door that was right outside of Ernestine's door. But that's not the way the offender went. That's the way someone would go if you didn't know the layout of this house. Because the other way, it just doesn't make sense, and it's really not intuitive, even though it's the shortest way. We know the offender went that way, the shortest way, the least intuitive way, because he arrives at Ernestine's room very quickly, and Ernestine is obviously armed with this little pistol, and he fires a couple of rounds. Now, we know he came that way because one of the rounds actually embeds itself in the door frame of the door that comes from the formal living room. So we know he didn't come through that door. And then, of course, he hits Ernestine in the face with 2 shots and she goes down. And there's quite a bit of arterial spray from the injury that sprays back on the carpeting. And then we also have blood spatter right on the wall where she was shot. So it's clear we know exactly where she was shot, and she goes down very quickly. He expended 3 shots at that location. Now, He shot Ernestine. She's down. He's killed Joni and he's killed Lindsay. But Marcus is still in the bedroom alive. And Marcus is a 4-year-old. Marcus could articulate if he knew or could describe the offender. So after killing Ernestine, now he backtracks back down the hall, back through that room next to the kitchen, back into the family room, and then back down the hallway to Joni's room. When he enters the room, Marcus is on the other side of the king bed. He walks around the bed all the way to where Marcus is. And now Marcus is looking at the offender. He's looking at his face, and the offender takes the handgun, places it near contact to Marcus's temple, and shoots him in the head. The reason that I know that Marcus was sitting up, because when they find Marcus, of course, he's covered with all these pillows. But there's blood on the sheets that cover his lower legs, and there's blood just below his neck area. But there's no blood really in his waist area, what we call a void pattern. And it makes sense because when we see the injuries that Marcus has, and because Marcus was alive for maybe a minute or minute and a half, Marcus was so terrified that he was actually biting through his fingers, and he bit so hard he was biting down to the bone. His fingers were bleeding, and this blood was running out of his mouth and dripping down onto the chest area where he was, and also dripping onto the sheets, which covered his thighs. But it didn't hit any of the sheet because he was sitting up and sitting forward. That whole area was protected from the blood drips. So we know he was sitting up because that void pattern tells us, and the blood on his thighs and the blood right below his neck tell us. And we know from the injuries that he had significant biting injuries on his fingers, which took time to do. I mean, he's aware of what's going on here. And of course, he sees the offender walk back into the room, walk over to him, then shoot him in the head, and he falls back onto the bed.
Wow. The whole visualization of that is just making my heart beat. It's
terrifying.
Horrific.
It was terrifying for him. It was horrific. It was just horrific for him. You know, Joni was asleep. She didn't know. Lindsay was probably asleep. It doesn't look like she moved because it happened so fast. But poor Marcus, as a 4-year-old, clearly understood what was going on here. After all this is done, so everybody's dead now. 5 people in this household are dead. The offender really, because this is a Sunday afternoon and you're firing a handgun, you don't know if people outside have heard the shots and have called the police or trying to investigate themselves. It's dangerous, right? So really what you should be doing is getting out of there, right? Getting away from the scene, but that's not what happens. The offender stays around, and what does he do? So now everybody's dead. First, he goes into the kitchen and he gets a knife out of this knife block. If you were to look at photographs of the kitchen, it's kind of messy. There's lots of stuff, a lot of things on the countertops. The butcher block is sort of hidden in the back under a counter, but it's blocked by a lot of other things. Essentially, my takeaway was that you had to know where that butcher block was. I mean, you might have found it by going in and searching around, but this was not well visible. I thought you would have to know where this was. So he goes back into the kitchen now and he gets a knife and he goes back, and now Joni's dead. So why are you stabbing her? But he stabs her 8 times. They're rather superficial injuries. They aren't very deep, maybe like an inch or an inch and a half, which is not that deep for a knife that's got a 6-inch blade on it. So he's not done there. But then he takes the sheet and he covers her up. Now, why would you do that? Well, that's a behavioral dynamic that we call undoing. Undoing behavior essentially is a ritualized behavior that, from our perspective in crime scenes, indicates remorse. It's essentially a symbolic attempt to undo the murder. Obviously, you can't undo it, but you can do things that make the injuries at least not visible. When we see undoing behavior, and we don't see it very often, but typically it's behavior that focuses on the victim. So you see bandaging or applying dressings to injuries. You can see the offender wash up the injuries, clean up the body, clean the blood off. put the person into a comfortable position. So they might lie them on the bed with their feet together, their hands over their chest, sort of this position of peaceful repose. They might put a pillow under their head. They might redress them into something that isn't bloody. So they clean the wounds. They put something else on them. They can decorate the body like a shrine, like the person's favorite things around them. There are all of these really interesting dynamics. They're not trying to tell you that I didn't kill the person. What they're doing is essentially a ritualized type of behavior that indicates a level of remorse. And how do you have remorse? You don't generally have remorse if you're a stranger. You don't see strangers doing that. And that's the important dynamic in undoing behavior, is that it's typically somebody who has a relationship with the victim. That's why they're doing it. There's no reasons to stab her once she's already dead, but that itself indicates a relationship dynamic, that it's not enough just to shoot her. Now, I'm still angry with her. I'm going to go get a knife and I'm going to stab her, even though she's already dead. But once I stab her, like, what is she dressed in? She's in her bra. She's in her underwear. I have a relationship with her. I don't want somebody to see her like this. So I'm going to cover her up. I'm going to cover up the injuries. Almost looks like she's just sleeping. Of course, she's not. That undoing told me that there's some relationship dynamic here. Now that he's done that, so now Marcus is laying there in full view of the offender. But that's really uncomfortable for the offender. So he goes out. He doesn't use pillows from the bedroom. He actually goes out into the family room and he grabs these big pillows and brings them back and covers up Marcus and clearly covers up Marshall. When you actually stand at the foot of the bed, you can't see anybody because Joni's face is turned away towards the headboard and she's got the sheet pulled up over her. The sheet's pulled up over Marshall. He's got this pillow and the other big pillows on him. Marcus's whole upper body is covered with a pillow. When you see offenders engage in this kind of behavior, we call this depersonalization. Depersonalization is an attempt to depersonalize an individual, to make somebody an object, to change them from a person into an object. Because for offenders, objects are much easier to deal with than looking at somebody. And if the relationship you have with them is close, then it's just easier if you don't have to see them, right? Because now they're not a person anymore. They've got this pillow over them. They're just an object, and it's easier for me to deal with it. When we talk about depersonalization, we typically talk about disfiguring a face. Sometimes the offender will disfigure the face by blunt force trauma or cutting injuries so that they're unrecognizable. They can cover them with pillows and blankets. It's about obscuring the victim's identity, depriving someone of their individuality or human characteristics. How do we interpret depersonalization? Well, we interpret it as being either uncomfortable with death or injury because they're going to do something else. And that's what happens in this room. So if you're going to do something else in the room, you don't want to really look at what you've done here. So you kind of hide it. I had a case out of San Mateo where the offender wrapped the woman's head in duct tape. Her whole head was covered in duct tape, which obscured her identity. And she was already dead when he did this because he wanted to have sex with her after death. But he knew her and he knew her pretty well. And he was really uncomfortable looking at her face when he was doing this. So he basically changed her into an object in order to engage with her. The point is that when you see depersonalization, it generally tells me there's a relationship between the offender and the victim. And that's also what undoing was telling me as well. Then we have, is what I described earlier in the laundry room, we had the purse that was all dumped out and then everything taken out of it. And I saw that as staging behavior. Staging behavior is really an attempt by the offender to change the crime scene, to basically create a new scene that has a new motive. In this case, the motive would be robbery or burglary. They typically stage cases by manipulating the behavioral or forensic evidence. They can remove evidence. They can introduce fake evidence or spurious evidence. They can create contrived behaviors. Typically, what they create is one of two crime scenes. That is, the motive for the crime now becomes burglary or robbery. And so they make it look like there were things they were trying to steal, or they were in the process of stealing them. Or they make it look like sexual assault. They might take the victim's clothing off. They might put them into a provocative sexual position, suggesting sexual assault. The way that I look at staging and the way that I determine staging, because it's really on a continuum. Sometimes I've done cases which have terrible staging and other cases where it's quite good. But you have to look at the totality of the circumstances. You're looking at the forensic evidence, the behavior. You look at victimology in terms of what would the victims do or not do. You look for logical behaviors that are absent in the crime scene. I'm basically looking and analyzing the behavior and reconciling that with the logic of the forensic evidence. Does this make sense? People stage crime scenes because the way that they interpret their behavior is like, I've killed this person, but if I just leave, the police are going to look at this and I'm going to become a primary suspect very quickly. So what they try to do is create a new scene, burglary, sexual assault, and that's the new motive. But their reference for creating these is not because they're a rapist or a sexual assaulting individual or a robber or a burglar. They're not those types of criminals. So where is their frame of reference for creating that kind of scene? Well, typically it comes from television, what they see on television or what they read in books. But the problem is that in staged crime scenes, when I talked earlier about the story of the crime doesn't make sense then. Things are out of chronological order. They're out of the time order. They don't make sense. If you're going to stage it to be a sexual assault, then shouldn't the person be sexually assaulted? If you're going to stage it to be a robbery, shouldn't property be missing?
Was there any property missing in this case?
No, there's no property. And not only that, in the master bedroom, and I think this was one of the reasons why Marcus and the others got covered up with these pillows, is because there was this 60-inch flat screen television. Back in 2003, flat screen televisions were really big and they were quite thick and very heavy. The offender undid all the cordage on the back of this 60-inch television, which is sitting opposite the bed. He picked up this television. My thought is, if your goal is to steal this television and you've gone to the trouble of picking it all up, taking all the cords off and picking it up, shouldn't your next step be to take it out of the house? But instead, that's not what happens. Instead, he lays the television on the floor, screen side down. This way, it looks like someone was going to steal the television, but it's not stolen. This way, it doesn't get damaged either. Now you have the staging in the laundry room, you have the staging in the master bedroom, all making it look like this really was the goal. And then in the process, we just killed everybody in the house. What's also interesting is that right on the little table that's right next to the television was $103 in cash, in bills, sitting right out in the open. So if this is a robbery and your goal is to steal stuff, there's no searching of any jewelry boxes. There's no searching of any drawers, especially in the master bedroom where you might expect to find valuables. Clearly in plain view is this cash and it's not touched. So that would clearly be something you'd scoop up while you're in the room because, of course, that's why you're there, to steal stuff. And then, the television's not taken. Now you have this staging, which then tells me, okay, the person staging this crime scene is doing it because they don't want to be considered a suspect. You have undoing behavior, which suggests a relationship dynamic between the victim and at least the primary victim and the offender. And you have depersonalization. That suggests a relationship between the offender and the victim. And of course, the television being placed down and not taken is what I call proprietary interest. Sometimes in these cases where, let's say it's the husband and he's killed his wife, but he wants to make it look like it's a robbery. It's not a personal cause homicide. he takes a bunch of her jewelry and he takes other items that belong to her. But his firearms, his camera, his stereo system, that doesn't get taken. And you go in there as an investigator and you go, gosh, all of her stuff's missing, the valuable stuff, but all his valuable stuff is still here. We call that proprietary interest because he's going like, well, I can't steal my stuff because then that stuff can never show up again.
Right. I want my stuff.
Yeah, I want my stuff.
Fascinating.
That's the way I look at the television. It's like, this is my television. Like if I steal this television
or damage it,
I'm going to have to buy another television. I'm not going to steal it, but I don't want it damaged. So I'm going to put it on the floor face down. So the cops have to basically step over it and go, yeah, looks like they were going to steal this, but must have gotten interrupted or something. The whole, trying to protect your own property. Again, another dynamic that starts to point to someone close to this scene. I got involved in this case about 4 weeks after the homicides. I'd worked with Bakersfield and other Los Angeles area agencies. So I started getting involved in this investigation before we had developed a suspect in this case.
Can we take just a little detour and explain that process? Because you are an FBI agent, you're working in the behavioral analysis unit. Can they request you directly, or do they just have to make a general request to the unit for assistance and you were assigned? I just think it's important for people to get an idea how that works.
Sure. The unit has changed over the years, but the way that we had the unit set up was when I was there, we only had 8 profilers that served adult crimes in the United States and in the world, actually, because we work cases all over the world. So we have to triage cases as they come in. What cases can we work? What cases we just don't have time for? So we were arranged at that time geographically. Because I had been a cop in California and a detective working in homicide before I became an FBI agent, I was assigned to the West Coast of the United States. I was assigned to 6 Western states of the United States. So cases that came in from California, Oregon, Washington, Alaska, Hawaii, and Nevada were all cases that would get assigned to me. Later on in the unit, as years went by, it just became sort of difficult sometimes because there'd be more cases in one region. So we started getting assigned cases around the country. That's how that could change. But yeah, because I was assigned to the West Coast, I typically got the cases and worked with those agencies. And I really was assigned the West Coast because I had been a West Coast cop and I knew a lot of agencies there and had worked in California. So I didn't typically get assigned cases that were outside my region until years later. I spent almost 13 years in the unit. So we changed that process over the years. The other thing is, I think some people don't understand sometimes when they look at it, when we talk about the media, television shows where the FBI comes busting in and says, oh, we're taking over this case. I always cringe when I see those kinds of things. I think Die Hard was a good example of that. Like,
yes.
The FBI agents just come bursting in and they're going to take over this scene right now. I'm like,
yeah, that's one of my 20 cliches and misconceptions about the FBI. And that's number 2, that the FBI doesn't play well with others.
Right. Because the FBI doesn't actually investigate homicides, except when they occur on military reservations or Indian reservations, which is actually where I started my FBI career, on the Wind River Indian Reservation in Wyoming, working all the homicides and violent crimes. But we as an agency don't work homicide cases. So from a behavioral perspective, from the profiling unit, we have to be asked by an agency to assist them. They actually have to make a request, which they typically do, as you know, through the field office in which their agency resides. So in that case, you have Bakersfield making a request to the Sacramento field office for assistance. And that's typically how we get involved in the case. And then we have coordinators in the local field offices that then get in touch with us. We don't reach out. We don't go, hey, Bakersfield had this really interesting mass murder case. Let's call them and see if, we can get involved. That's just simply not the way that we ever conduct our business. We don't have time to do things like that anyway. That's not the protocol. The agency who has the case has to make the request for our involvement. And then we triage the case and see whether we can be of assistance or not. That's essentially how I got involved in the Bakersfield case. But trial wasn't held until 2007, and I think I had just retired from the unit at that point. But I got involved early on when there was no suspect. How did the police move forward in this? The first thing they needed to do, of course, was to check Vincent Brothers' alibis. Are these consistent? Was he in Ohio? Clearly, it appeared to be. He flew to Ohio. There's credit card receipts on the day of the murder. And then after the murder, he and his brother drove from Ohio to where their mother lived in North Carolina. That's where Bakersfield police actually ended up contacting Vincent. He was in shock and disbelief that this could have happened. So they're working that angle, like what is really going on here. Of course, they're still working the gang angle and any other potential offenders. But of course, one of the key things was like, how would a gang member have gotten into the house? How would anybody outside of somebody who knew this house and knew the routine of the Harpers on Sundays, how would they have been able to access this without alerting anybody? Because you certainly couldn't have gotten into the house. What do we really know? Here's what police learn. And this relates to Vincent Brothers, because ultimately he becomes the individual that gets focused on in this case. We know Vincent Brothers' timeline through 7/2 when he flew out of Los Angeles to Ohio, and through 7/8 when he arrived in North Carolina with his brother to visit their mother. What issues do we have here? So they wanted to find out, okay, when you were in Ohio, what did you do? Well, he rented a car. All right, so let's get the information regarding the rental car. That became the first big clue, is that he paid cash for this rental car, and this rental car had an amazing number of miles on it. And there were actually a couple of dynamics that really helped us out in this. He rented the car on 7/2, and the rental car mileage at the time was 2709. This was a really new car. It had only been rented twice before Vincent rented it. And this car never left the city in Ohio where it was rented. So that was a huge help. When Vincent Brothers returned the car on 7/11, it had 8,133 miles on it.
Wow.
So 5,424 miles had been put on the car in 9 days.
Wow.
So now they were concerned that Vincent may have actually rented the car and driven back to Bakersfield, which is in fact what happened. He drove nonstop back to Bakersfield. That mileage from Columbus, Ohio to Bakersfield is about 2,423 miles. And we know this because the detectives actually drove this round trip to find out what kind of mileage we're talking about. He paid cash for gas. One of the people asked, well, yeah, but wasn't he spending money on the day of the murders in Columbus? Wasn't he going to a restaurant and going
That's right. We had those
to
receipts.
the Walmart? Well, they recovered surveillance video from the Walmart, and it turns out brother Melvin, who had been using the credit card, what Vincent told his brother was, look, I'm going to give you my credit card. I'd like you to make some purchases on 7/6 on Sunday. And that's what happened. They went to a restaurant, they charged the meal, they went to Walmart, they bought some items. But the surveillance video proved that it wasn't Vincent that was actually making the purchases. And another really interesting dynamic related to the car itself. The prosecutors had this interesting idea. They decided to get the rental car. It had only been rented 3 times, with Vincent renting it the last time. They said, let's pull the radiator out of the car and let's send the radiator to a forensic entomologist. They sent the radiator to UC Davis to a forensic entomologist there. An entomologist is an expert in insects. What she did was she took the radiator and she removed with a pair of tweezers every single insect in that radiator. And then she identified every one of those insects. We knew that prior to Vincent's rental, that the car had not left Columbus, Ohio. What she determined was that the radiator had a number of bugs in it that were only found west of the Rockies. And she identified each one of these species of grasshoppers and other insects and said, okay, this bug is only found in Arizona, California, and Utah. This bug is only found in Arizona, California, Oregon, and Nevada. Here we had clear forensic proof that the car had actually traveled west of the Rockies.
This is fascinating. I'm just amazed that the detective thought about doing this. I mean, I've never heard of it before. This is like something you would see on a TV crime show, like Law and Order.
Right. Right. I actually had never heard of it before. It was a brilliant idea because how do you defeat that in court? I mean, you can say, yes, there's 6,000 miles have been put on the car in space of 9 days. But that doesn't prove that that car went to California. I mean, you could have said, yeah, it drove down to Florida, then drove to Michigan and went out to Maine. There could have been other explanations, not reasonable, but there could have been other explanations. But here you had clear forensic physical evidence that bugs in the radiator were only found west of the Rockies. They simply do not live in the Midwestern states. They don't exist there. It proved that the car had those bugs in it. And since the two previous drivers had never left Columbus, ipso facto, well, if you're the third renter of the car and you have all this mileage, you're probably the person that went west of the Rockies. It was very difficult for brothers to overcome that. And then, of course, when you add on my testimony, and I didn't testify about brothers because I analyzed the crime scene and the crime and all of the dynamics that are attendant to that scene. So I talked about staging behavior. I talked about undoing, depersonalization, proprietary interest, how you recognize it in the scene, and what it generally means. Not that Vincent Brothers was the killer. It just means that somebody, this was the prosecutor's job then to say who that somebody was. My job was to say, yeah, all of this behavioral stuff really indicates that the person who did these murders had a relationship, close relationship with the victim. And I might add also, I talked about the proprietary interest related to the television, but when you see the murder of very young children, you always wonder why, because clearly Marshall, 6-week-old infant, and Lindsay, 2 years old, they cannot be witnesses. I'm not even sure Marcus could have been a witness, but Marcus clearly could have described his father. But the 2-year-old and the 6-week-old, why are you killing children? And when I see really young children killed, I think proprietary interest. There's a reason the offender is killing the children. And in this case, when you look back at the history and the dynamics of Vincent Brothers, you find out that Joni was in the process of getting ready to divorce him. He was seeing and living with another woman, which had happened in the past. He'd slept with other women, had other affairs, but he was not living in the house. He had his own apartment. He saw the kids as an impediment to his future life because, yes, he really hated Joni for all of this, but killing Joni doesn't solve his problems because you have very young children. The courts will find that you are financially responsible for these young children through probably age 21. Well, Vincent didn't want that responsibility. He was really interested in starting a new life without any encumbrances of kids or an ex-wife. The question is, well, why don't you just get divorced? We hear that a lot. For Vincent, getting divorced doesn't really solve all of his issues. Then he's got alimony, he's got child support, he's got to deal with the family members. He doesn't want any of that. He wants to start a new life with the new girlfriend, unencumbered by kids or alimony payments or child support. For him, the best way to do that is just to kill the kids. But as investigators and as a profiler, we look at the murder of very, very young children as very problematic. You could let the child live. There's no way that the child could identify you in any way, shape, or form. So why kill the child? Because it's proprietary interest in your future financial benefit. So you kill a 6-week-old infant. That was a hallmark for me when I see that. When I see young children murdered, I'm immediately thinking somebody very close. I talked about all this during the trial. My evidence really just sort of adds to the forensic evidence that they had with the car mileage and proving who had rented the car. Vincent said, yeah, I put all this mileage on the car. He didn't say where he'd gone. And then you have the forensic evidence related to the insects in the radiator. And you just go, wow, that is amazing, actually.
That's the evidence that indicates he did it. What's his defense?
Here's the thing. When I testify in these trials, I am not there for the entire trial. I have a very specific role in the case because I get asked these questions, right? So I say, look, my role is very specific. I'm analyzing the crime and the crime scene dynamics on the day of the murders or the couple days within the murders. I'm not looking at the offender. I don't care who the offender is. In police investigations, especially long ones like this that go over several years, suspects rise and fall. One day it's some gang member they're looking at. The next day it's a registered sex offender. They rise in interest and then they rule them out and then they drop off the radar. I am not concerned with that part of the investigation. I'm concerned with a very small dynamic. I don't get involved in those kinds of issues. This trial, as I recall, multi-weeks long, 6 to 8 weeks long. The jurors saw 1,100 exhibits and they listened to 137 witnesses. I was one of those witnesses, as was Dr. Kimsey, the forensic entomologist. I don't follow the case that way. I learned the outcome at the end. And it's really helpful for me because when I come in as an expert, I can say, look, this is what I did. I'm not sitting in the courtroom listening to this. I'm not linking Vincent Brothers to the crime. That's not my role. That's the jury's role. They make the ultimate decision about guilt or innocence. That's the judge's role. My role is really limited. I didn't listen to the case. I don't know what Vincent Brothers' explanation for the mileage. I don't know that he actually provided one. I clearly understand why he did it, to further this affair/relationship that he was having with the other woman. So he didn't have to pay alimony or child support, that he could start over. I understand that, but I didn't really get into what his explanation for all of this was. I know he did take the stand, which is unusual for someone in a murder case, for the defendant to actually take the stand. He did, but I don't think his testimony served him very well.
Well, let me let everybody know that you were the host of a TV show called Killer Instinct. And this was one of the episodes, one of the cases that you and the police detective and others involved in this case profiled. And so there are some more details, and I'll put a link to that episode, which you're able to watch the full episode so that listeners can get more information or to look at a reenactment of this investigation.
Right. So, yeah, Killer Instinct was a series that I did of 13 of very high profile cases that I worked on, produced by NBC. And this Vincent Brothers case is one of those. So if you watch the episode, you'll actually get to see the crime scene photos, the victims, and that sort of thing at the crime scene. I think listening to the podcast and watching the episode so they can actually see the crime scene will really help them understand the dynamics of this case. It will give you a better perspective about the things that I'm talking about. I provided a link for you. And actually, I think all the episodes are available to view there. You can get them on Amazon or iTunes. I don't get anything from those episodes, but they are available for people to watch.
I'll have all of that in the show notes with a couple of the crime scene photos that you also shared with me. So how did this end?
So we didn't have the trial until 2007, fascinatingly enough. Vincent Brothers, I think he was convicted on May 17th of 2007. He was sentenced to death because it was a capital murder case. He was sentenced to death on May 29th of 2007. He then went to death row in San Quentin Prison in California. He appealed his conviction, but his appeal was denied. So he is currently sitting on death row, which is where he will sit because California doesn't execute anybody. So he'll just be on death row until he finally shuffles off his mortal coil and faces his maker. When you talk about an individual who can murder his children, it's one thing when they're sleeping and to shoot them. But for Marcus, That is a true cold-blooded psychopath. That is somebody completely devoid of a conscience, that they are able to execute their son while he's looking at you in just this terrified way, biting his fingers because he's so afraid down to the bone. And your response to that is to put a gun to his forehead and shoot him in the head. There's true evil, and I think Vincent Brothers embodies that level of malevolence. If you think about why he did it really for financial reasons. So he didn't have to pay for his kids, which in and of itself is another just really horrific aspect of this. I would say Vincent Brothers would score extremely high on the psychopathy checklist, and he is sitting where he belongs to be sitting.
All I can say is wow. In my mind, because like most of us, I love my kids. I love all kids. I love my family. I need to ask you to talk to us a little bit more about family annihilators and filicide. I think that's the term for killing family members.
Yes, right. Killing children, filicide. Yeah. Most actually family annihilators are often females, because when females kill, they don't typically have the strength to use the weapons that males use. So their children are often the targets of their violence. And you can see this in the case of Susan Smith, who drowned her kids in North Carolina, Andrea Yates, who drowned her 5 children in Texas, Darla Routier, who stabbed her 2 kids to death in Texas. I'm trying to think of the other woman who shot her child, tried to kill her children. Most of the time, it's because the kids are encumbrances to them and they want to start a new life without having to deal with children or payments to support them. You do have male family annihilators like John List, which was a famous case where he killed all of his children and his whole family, and then fled and was on the lam for decades before he was identified and arrested. And Vincent Brothers is one of those guys, family annihilators. Oftentimes, in Vincent's case, was to avoid having to take care of his children, either physically or financially. Other times, a couple of years ago, I was a co-author on an article about revenge filicide, where you see parents, whether it's the males, it's typically the male, the father, but sometimes the mother, who kills the children to punish the other spouse. Sometimes they take their own life, but typically they kill the children. The children become essentially the foil that the spouse uses against the other parent. I'm not going to let you have these kids. So rather than in a custody battle, let you get custody, I'd rather kill them so that you can't get them. It's essentially just this revenge dynamic. We published an article that looked at 62 international cases of it. It's not common, but yeah, family annihilators are an interesting dynamic. The typical, profile would be males mostly, and they do it because they reach a point in their life when their whole world is falling apart. They've lost their job. They don't have any money. They're deeply in debt. They don't see a future. Their wife doesn't love them. Everything that can go wrong in their life is going wrong. And oftentimes, it's basically like, I am not going to subject my children to what he perceives or she perceives to be the inability to be the family supporter, breadwinner. It's too devastating for them emotionally. And so the way that they solve this problem is just to kill everybody and oftentimes kill themselves, but not always. Sometimes they survive. It's fairly rare in homicide annals, but there are plenty of cases of family annihilators. Males will typically do it with firearm. Females will typically do it with poison or by drowning, suffocation, because they're typically killing their children as well.
Just unbelievable to think somebody could hate that much that they could seek revenge on a spouse by killing the children.
I know. It really is, sort of defies imagination that you could use your children as the tools. They just become objects to you that you use against your spouse.
Now, you hear about
You know,
people burning their husband's clothes or crashing and damaging the wife's car or taking things that belong to the spouse that you're so angry at and destroying
right,
them.
right.
But children?
I know because for most people, normal people, that just is unconscionable to kill your own children. It's just unconscionable. I don't think that Vincent Brothers was angry. I think he was angry with his wife because she was preparing to divorce him. And of course, that would have been a disaster in terms of financial responsibility for him. That would have just upset all his plans. I don't think he was angry with the children, but the children were just impediments. They just had to be eliminated because, as Vincent was probably thinking, I'm just unwilling to spend the next 20 plus years shelling out money for these kids that I don't really even care about. And if I can get rid of my wife, I'm angry, but also I don't have to pay any alimony. But I can't just go kill them because police will go, oh my gosh, it's probably the husband. So he sets up this elaborate plan to have an alibi by being in Ohio. But as soon as he arrives in Ohio, he rents his car and he immediately starts driving nonstop back to Bakersfield, paying cash for gas so it can't be tracked on his credit cards. And then, of course, setting up his brother as sort of the alibi on the day of the murder. Hey, on Sunday, I want you to spend money that makes it look like I'm there. And then killing his family and turning right around and driving nonstop back to Columbus, Ohio.
He easily could have gotten away with all of that if it wasn't for the tenacity of the detective assigned to the case.
Exactly. Yeah, it's an amazing case. Vincent wasn't arrested for 10 months because they were trying to work all this out. He had this alibi. You can't just go, yeah, it sounds like the husband. You have to be able to prove that it's him, that it isn't some gang member or something else going on. And being able to show this dynamic of depersonalization and staging behavior, staging the crime scene to look like it's a robbery, the proprietary interest in the television, the depersonalization by covering up the victims, and then this undoing with, this post-mortem stabbing of Joni. And then after you're done, covering her up with a sheet. Why are you doing all this? Most people will go, what's going on here? Yeah, that doesn't make any sense. But it does make sense. It absolutely makes sense in terms of this undoing behavior. And I've testified as an expert about this kind of behavior in other crime scenes. And so when you put all of that together, along with the forensics of the car and the mileage and the two previous renters who didn't leave Columbus and the forensic entomologist who testified about the bugs in the radiator, it becomes overwhelming evidence. And that's exactly the way the jury saw it.
Excellent. All right. Well, this looks like it's going to be another longer episode because I always have so many questions for you. And I thought that we would switch up a little bit. The last time that we spoke on episode 204, which I'll also link in the show notes for this episode so people can listen to that next, we talked at the end about the interest in true crime and about the TV shows and the books. And it was a great conversation. And of course, I'm involved in all of that myself now. But I'm also involved in crime fiction, and I'm writing my third crime novel now. I wanted to talk about how FBI profilers are portrayed in the entertainment industry, so in crime fiction. I actually watched a movie recently with Angela Jolie, and it was called
Taking Lives.
Thank you.
Yeah, really a terrible movie.
Yes, Taking Lives. And I'm telling you, I look at those movies and then I do a review, not for the quality of the movie, which I would love to, but I do it really for the accuracy of whether the movie and its portrayal of the FBI and FBI agents is accurate. Are they looking at policy and procedures that we actually are required to follow? So it sounds like you saw the movie.
Well, I started watching it and then partway through, sometimes I just throw my hands up at these law enforcement movies because I just can't watch them. And especially if they're involving profilers, because then I really, it becomes very problematic. I would say that there are some very good shows out there, and I do make recommendations for people to watch shows. Interestingly enough, most of them come out of the UK or Europe, Sweden or Finland or the UK. Very few shows actually come out of the US that I like. I was a consultant for CSI Las Vegas for over 8 years, also for Bones and The Blacklist. When I consult for these shows, what they're trying to determine is when they have a particular type of scene, they're trying to get it right. They're trying to get how the offender behaves, how the victim would likely behave. What are the dynamics within the crime that would be realistic? So they're not making it up. They want to have a level of accuracy that has to be balanced with entertaining people. That's the dynamic. The job that I do, that I did in the FBI's behavioral analysis unit, when you watch it day to day, it's very boring, actually. I sit with case materials and I do a microanalysis of all of the information that I analyze and then ultimately interpret and in many cases write reports about. Sometimes I visit the scenes if I think they're hard to understand or they're complicated or multi-leveled. But oftentimes I can do an analysis with just the actual crime scene photos and the photos that are provided.
So you don't need to engage with the subject. You don't need to chase them down an alley or meet them in the basement or...
In shows like Criminal Minds and Profiler and, originally in X-Files, you have to entertain people. So they can't just have profilers doing what we do. One of the fallacies is that typically they have like a whole team. In Criminal Minds, they have a whole team of people going out. That just never happened with us. One, because we're a small unit. We were a small unit, 8 of us in the adult crimes unit, 8 in the child crimes unit. And you're covering cases all over the US, around the world. You don't have time to fly 5 people or 6 people on a case. It doesn't happen. You would be lucky if you can send 2 people, but typically it's just yourself going out. And we don't fly on the G5. Only the director flies on the G5. We fly commercial coach. We don't do DNA analysis. We aren't analyzing evidence. We aren't making calls that the forensic pathologist should be making. We don't go to fresh crime scenes. And the reason that we don't is because there's a lot of information that we need that isn't available once the murder has happened. And I've worked on a number of serial murder task forces. So if a case happens, I would go with them to the new case. But typically, the information that we need is not available usually for weeks. That is, reports have to be written and reviewed. The forensic pathologist has to do the autopsy, which may take several days. The report's not available for a week and a half or so. Forensic evidence has to be tested at the lab. That's not available right after the crime happens. We have to develop victimology. So there's a lot of history that has to be taken. There's interviews of witnesses and neighborhood canvases. All of that has to be conducted, and it takes days to do those kinds of things. We typically don't get involved in cases until sometimes months later or years later. And often the reason that agencies are asking us for help is because their case is cold. In movies and in television shows, the entertainment component, you're trying to solve a case in 47 minutes. Sans commercials. So you have to have DNA that's done in a day and forensic evidence that's all tested and fingerprints that are lifted off of firearms or surfaces that we typically don't lift fingerprints off of. All the interviews are done. You have a suspect, you're going in to interview them. That's really not what we do. But it makes for entertaining television when you're watching those shows. They have to pull all this stuff together, but that's not what criminal profilers do.
Yeah, and I think in my reviews and, of course, in my book, which I had to plug, FBI Myths and Misconceptions, a manual for armchair detectives, I do talk about that. The fact that now serial killer crime fiction is its own genre. It's established that this is what a profiler is going to do and that they're going to be active in the investigation, that they're going to have a role. So I accept that now. I don't have to, read the books or watch the movies or things like that if I don't want to. We, you and I and other law enforcement folks are not their target audience, but I do accept that. But I do like to take time to talk to experts like you to just explain to people, especially those interested in becoming behavioral analysts or FBI profilers, that it is not the way it is portrayed on TV.
Well, that's true. This all kicked off with essentially Silence of the Lambs, which was sort of the bellwether for this interest in behavioral profiling. And I think a lot of people, after they watch Silence of the Lambs and Manhunter, the prequel, actually, and others think that I want to become an FBI profiler. I hear this all the time. And I'll go into the FBI and then I'll become a profiler. But that route that's not how it happens. I tell most people, especially people in high school or in college who are interested in this, I said, here was the journey for me in a nutshell. To be competitive, to get into the FBI, although you can get in when you're 23, almost nobody does because they're not competitive against the tens of thousands of other people that are applying to be FBI agents. So you're going to have your university 4-year degree, and you're going to have a number of years of work experience. So I said the average age of agents getting into the FBI, when I came in, it was like 29 and a half because you just aren't competitive until you have that level of work experience under your belt.
It still is. Yeah, it
or
still
an
is.
advanced degree, and then you become an agent. So you're so far away from becoming a profiler at this point. All you are is an agent. And now you have to prove yourself in the field as a competent field agent, how to conduct investigations, how to write reports, how to testify in court. And you have to have a great history of that. And then if you want to be a profiler, you probably should get involved in the National Center for the Analysis of Violent Crime Coordinator program, which every FBI field office has. They're the intermediary between the Behavioral Analysis Unit and the agencies that they serve. I said, I came into the FBI at 29 and a half. I went to Wyoming. My goal coming in was to become a profiler because as a detective working on homicides, I ended up working with the unit and sending some cases back because I had gone to a school that had a couple of FBI profilers in 1982 and became fascinated with it, submitted my cases, worked with the unit and decided that's what I wanted to do. So I came into the FBI wanting to do that, but I spent my first 3.5 years on an Indian reservation in Wyoming working really all the violent crimes there. And then I went to New York City, was working undercover and became a NCAVC coordinator there, and then was teaching homicide schools for the various law enforcement academies, was in New York for 5.5 years. And then went to Sacramento, where I was in the Stockton office working violent crimes and became the NCAVC coordinator in Sacramento. I spent almost 11 years in the field before positions opened up in the behavioral analysis unit for which I applied. And most people don't understand that the profilers are supervisory special agents. So it's a promotional position. You don't just get sent there. You have to compete against a bunch of other qualified people who also want to be profilers. And because the unit's small, it's very competitive. I didn't actually get into the unit until I was almost 40 years old. When I tell young people that, they just kind of go, oh, really? Because, for them, being 40, it's a lifetime away. I got into the unit. That was my goal. That's what I wanted to do. And I stayed until I retired at age 53. And then I started my own business with Bob Ressler, one of the legends in this field, until he passed away 6 years after that. Now I've been doing this outside of the bureau in my own business for 15 and a half years, and I still love it. And I still am active filming for television. I just filmed last week for a couple of shows for Plum Productions out of the UK. I've had my own television series in Europe and here. I still am publishing, writing articles. We're just actually getting ready to publish an article on serial sexual homicide by juveniles, which is a really interesting area. So I'm still testifying and working cases, and I still love this discipline, but it's a long road. It's a long journey to become an FBI criminal profiler. And it isn't like, I'll apply to get into the bureau and then I'll apply to be an FBI profiler.
So that's not how it works.
Well, it doesn't work like that.
Let me just ask you 2 more questions. One more about taking lives. As I review this movie for FBI accuracy, one of the first things that happens is that she is invited to go to Canada to help work on this serial murder case. And I know I've done an interview with an agent where he was in Ghana helping to work on a serial murder case. So I know that profilers do assist even internationally with law enforcement agencies and partners. Yes. Can we talk about that?
Sure. I've worked cases in Brazil, Ireland, South Africa, Morocco, Canada. I've worked cases all over. And it's essentially the same dynamic. You have an agency. So I worked double murder of American citizens in Rio de Janeiro, really brutal murders in their home with their children. And it's the same dynamic. So the agency, in this case, then has to contact the legal attaché that covers their country. And they have to make a request through the FBI's legal attaché. And then the legal attaché then contacts the behavioral unit and makes a request for assistance. Again, we don't insert ourselves into either U.S. cases or international cases. Those have to come through a request by that agency for assistance. So, sure, we work cases in Canada, although most of the Canadians, the Ontario Provincial Police and the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, both have really excellent behavioral profiling units. It would be unlikely that they would ask us for assistance unless it was something very, very specific. They have very qualified profilers. So my guess is they wouldn't have asked us to go to Canada. They would have had an RCMP criminal profiler working on their cases. And that makes sense too, because legally then they can testify and they know the ins and outs of the Canadian legal system, whereas we would not. In countries that don't have profilers, sure, we get requests for assistance, but I wouldn't expect that to happen from the Canadians. I think what really makes a great profiler is your analytical ability and the ability to use analytic logic. As Sherlock Holmes once described, that is a very key piece in being able to do this kind of work. That is, if you give people a scenario, like if you say, okay, this car is going to be racing down the street at 100 miles an hour, and this car is going to be going the opposite direction on the same street at 100 miles an hour, what's going to happen? Well, yeah, we can tell you as it progresses from A to D. What analytical logic is when you give them the outcome and then you ask them to work backwards. And in a car crash, you could probably figure that out. But in a complex homicide where you've got all kinds of stuff like what was going on in the brothers case, we've got all these different behavioral dynamics and access to the victims and all this stuff. And you've got a mass murder, which most agencies rarely ever work. You give them that scene and you go, okay, tell me what happened. And it's just like, oh my God, I have no idea. It's that analytical logic, being able to work backwards from something. You have to have an expertise in forensic pathology and forensic blood stain analysis and forensic entomology and psychopathy, because you bring all of those disciplines to bear on that case as you work it backwards. You have an experience of working hundreds and thousands of cases. So you've seen these different aspects to the case in the past, but I think that's really a key hallmark. And then I think the other really important point is being able to emotionally dissociate yourself from the gravity of the human brutality that you see in a lot of these cases. Oftentimes, I will get videotapes made by offenders of their crimes. And I'm telling you, it's just horrific, some of these. But you have to be able to emotionally dissociate yourself from the carnage that you're seeing and look at the dynamics in the case. That's hard for detectives to do because they're involved with the families, the victims, the offenders, and their families. They have a personal interest in these cases. I really try to stay objective. I don't have a dog in the fight, so to speak. My goal is to tell you what I believe to be the truth of the event. However that serves the investigation, my goal is to tell you what I think these dynamics are. Who it points to doesn't matter to me, but understanding what the actual truth of it is in an unemotional way. And that's very difficult for people to do on a repeated basis with such difficult, complex, and demoralizing type cases. You have to be a really good investigator.
In the movie, Taking Lives, Angela Jolie, they showed her as being cold and unattached.
I wouldn't be that way with the agencies. I never am. I'm very empathetic to the families and the dynamics of the case. But when I'm doing my analysis, I have a procedure and methodology for doing it, and I know what I'm looking for. For Angelina Jolie, she wants to lay down in the grave, right? Okay, no, that's just stupid. right? I mean, it probably looks good on television, to get a sense you want to lay down in the grave. I've never laid down in a grave before. I have crime scene photographs of the grave and of the excavation and all that, because my job is, I'm not doing this by touching. There was an old show called The Profiler, was one of the first shows that started this off. And there's this scene where she started laying hands on the case materials and rocking back in her chair, getting these visions. And I'm like, it's just ridiculous. That isn't how we solve these cases or assist the agencies. It's a really detailed analysis of the complexities in the case using your expertise and analytical logic. It's not laying down in graves and getting a feeling or touching crime scene photos and all of a sudden having some sort of mystical thing happen to you. It's not Ouija board stuff. It's not crystal ball stuff. It's really intense
academic analysis.
Yeah, it's an academic analysis with a lot of training and experience. And that's how you proceed to do these types of cases. It's really not that exciting, right? But, for television, it has to be made interesting for the audience. So that's what they do. They end up doing a lot of things that we would actually never do.
And I do say, in doing my consulting and my presentations to writers group, I always say the most important thing is your story. If you can make it accurate and show people how it's really done, that should be a goal. But entertaining your readers and your viewers is the most important thing. So we're on the same page. And in that thought, you said you were going to recommend some really good crime thrillers that are about profilers. And I think we should make sure that we follow up on that promise. So what would you recommend as good shows or good books that are fiction that people would enjoy?
All right. So for shows, I would say one of my favorite shows regarding profiling is a UK show called Wire in the Blood. Wire in the Blood. And another UK show and this was the initial setup, was Luther, Luther. Luther was very good. You have Happy Valley. I know it sounds weird, but Happy Valley is a great show. There's a UK show that involves the woman who was originally in X-Files. It escapes me now.
I know the show too. I can't think of it myself.
I think it was only 3 episodes long. It was quite good, about a serial killer. You have the 2 shows out of Sweden. One was in Swedish with English subtitles, and then Kenneth Branagh, he did the second series in English. That's good. If you just look up Kenneth Branagh, he's a profiler in Sweden. Good show. I have consulted on some book series. So a very good friend of mine, Alan Jacobson, who is a very well-respected author and great researcher, has his Karen Vale series of novels about female FBI profiler. And I actually appear in several of the books as myself, as an FBI profiler. But I've reviewed all of his books. They're excellent. He does such a great job of researching the books and getting everything just completely accurate. So if you look up the Karen Vale series, that's a really good series of books. I can't really recommend any US shows.
And not even Mindhunter, because I thought that followed.
Okay. Yeah. So Mindhunter is good. I have a personal issue with Mindhunter, but I think from the perspective of the show, it's pretty good. Yeah. That's one of the more realistic shows. They're actually, it's sort of in the 70s in the FBI's profiling and behavioral analysis unit, where Bob Ressler and John Douglas are going out and doing these interviews with these different killers. And I would say, yeah, it's a good show. It's pretty accurate. Unfortunately, they had the roles reversed for Ressler and Douglas, which was my own sort of pet peeve about it.
Right, because you were a colleague and a personal friend of his. I can understand that.
Yeah, of Ressler's, who was actually the instigator of the interviews. But yeah, overall, I think Mindhunter is actually a pretty good show. And the portrayals of the offenders in there are quite good as well.
I thought it followed what profilers actually do pretty well.
It's of the U.S. shows, that's a pretty good one. Yeah, I just find most of the good profiling shows are shows that come out of Europe. I don't know how it's just the way they make the shows. They're more intense. I think you really have to pay attention in those shows or else you'll get lost. And I think that might be the difference between what we produce in the US. The shows I recommended, I think, are very good and true to life. I was just trying to remember the Swedish show with Kenneth Branagh. And actually, both series are very good. They're very different. In the Kenneth Branagh series, he's a little more brooding and dark, but still really a good series. I have others that I could recommend if I just had a little time to think about them.
If you have time to jot down the names of your recommendations that you
Yeah.
couldn't think of today, then I'll include them in the show notes for
Okay.
this episode.
Sure. Yeah. But definitely Wire in the Blood. I would highly recommend that series. It's just phenomenal. They just do an excellent job. I actually think one of the researchers was a UK profiler that consulted on that show. And so I think they really got everything pretty much accurate on it. And I really enjoyed it.
All right. Looks like we have another almost 2-hour episode, which I have no problem with that because I'm just fascinated by all of this. But definitely some of the things that I normally would ask, such as when and why you joined the FBI, we've already covered that in episode 204. But I think in 2 years, you've probably come up with some more words of wisdom. So I'm still going to give you the last word. What would you like to say?
I would say that profilers have a very specific role in complex cases. Most violent crime cases are readily solved by very good law enforcement investigators. It's only when you get these really unusual, excessively violent, complex cases where this type of analysis is useful to push cases forward, to either help develop suspects or to move a case forward in trial, where you may have a very good circumstantial case, but still, when you have the ability to point out these various behavioral dynamics, it can really move a case over the top. I think it's not for every type of violent crime cases, but really sort of the extreme, much more difficult, complex cases.
And that's the end of the interview. At jerrywilliams.com, you'll find a photo of Mark Safarik, a longer bio for him, crime scene photos, as well as links to articles about this case and other family annihilation cases. And don't forget that Mark put together that list of what he believes are successful TV shows and movies featuring FBI profilers. I hope you enjoyed the interview and that you'll share it with your friends, family, and associates. You can show me just how much you liked it by buying me a coffee. There's a link in your podcast app's description of this episode, or you can visit jerrywilliams.com and tap on the little coffee cup icon in the bottom right-hand corner of my website. Don't forget to follow FBI Retired Case File Review on your favorite podcast app. Now, this podcast is all about true crime, but if you're also interested in crime fiction, once a month via my reader team email, I keep you up to date on the FBI and books, TV, and movies. When you join my reader team, you get access to my FBI reading resource, a colorful list of more than 70 books about the FBI written by FBI agents who have been guests on this podcast. There's nonfiction, crime fiction, true crime, and memoirs. You'll also get my FBI reality checklist, where I debunk 20 cliches about the FBI and receive news about what I'm up to and about my FBI nonfiction and crime fiction books. I want to thank you for listening to the very end. I hope you come back for another episode of FBI Retired Case File Review with Jerry Williams. Thank you.